Hello everyone, it is Wednesday, March 25th. Time flies when we're all stuck at home. Today, I'm going to show you how to make a yeast starter so that you can make any type of baking with this starter, and it will last you for as long as you want it to last. This can last you for years, and you won't need to go out and shop for any more yeast from the grocery store. I will also show you how you can safely share yeast with someone else. And then we're going to get into how you would use a starter yeast in baking versus how you might use a traditional yeast package. So let's start first with just yeast. And the reason I'm doing this today about yeast is I've had a lot of people calling and saying, or not calling, they're sending me messages via Facebook about running out of yeast or not being able to find any in a supermarket. I had one person say, I'm down to 3 packages, so I can only make 3 loaves of bread and then I'm done. Now, here's the thing. Yeast, it's kind of funny that we would ever run out of it because years ago you never went out and bought it very often. Usually it was just passed on from starter to starter. So when you shop for yeast now, it's kind of confusing at times. You have traditional yeast, you have instant yeast, you have pizza yeast, you have extra fast yeast, you have bread yeast. The reality is any of those products are going to be able to make a yeast culture that you can bake with. There's a little bit of marketing involved with all the different packages and all the sizes and the belief of what you have to use. You actually need very little yeast to be able to get going. Yeast only has really one purpose in life. It eats sugar, it breaks down flours or whatever you're going to feed it. In the case of when you're making wine, it breaks the fruit sugars down. It produces carbon dioxide, and then a byproduct, you make booze out of it, or it converts into a little bit of that liquid booze. But we're not worried about that. We're just trying to find a way that we can bake. So that's what our focus is going to be on today. All right, I've washed my hands. We're all set to go. I call it a yeast starter as opposed to calling it a sourdough starter because I don't want people to get confused that this can only be used for making sourdough bread. You can use a yeast starter for making anything, cinnamon rolls, pizza, buns, bread, you name it. If it has to rise, you can use it. Now you need a container to put your starter in. Today I am going to use a jar like this. It has a lid on the top. You need to have some sort of a lid. I've removed the rubber gasket because I want the carbon dioxide to be able to come out of it. Another common choice is to use a traditional quart jar. You want a minimum of a quart if you are going to be putting together a starter. And if you put it on, you wouldn't screw the lid on. Again, you want the air to be able, or the carbon dioxide to be able to come out. If you don't have either of those, don't go off to a store. You can use a bowl. You can use virtually any container. Just make sure you put something over top of it that still will allow for carbon dioxide to come out. We need a little bit of yeast, we need water, and we need flour to get going. Now, I am going to show you some alternatives to if you don't have yeast actually at your home, but we'll get to that in just a bit. When you're making a starter, we run with a 1-to-1, 1 part water and 1 part flour. Now that is by weight. We're not going to weigh it in a scale, so we're just going to know that it's going to be a little bit more flour than you'll need than the amount of water putting in. So I'm going to use a small container here. The water I'm using is a lukewarm, so the type of temperature that you would bathe a baby in. There we go. We'll put that in. Let's put a bit of flour. I'm going to put a bit more flour in than I did water, and I'll see how it all mixes up. There we go. Let's dump that in. Get a fork. Start moving that around a little bit. I think we can do just a little bit more water in there. It's hard to go wrong with this. Okay, before I mix it again, I'm going to put a bit of yeast in. This container has probably a bazillion little yeast particles inside there. Here we go. Let's just see. They're just little tiny little balls. Okay, all you need to get a yeast starter going is just a few little ones there. I don't know. There isn't even a spoon small enough to measure that amount. But that's actually going to make a starter that you could make hundreds and hundreds of loaves of bread just from that little amount of yeast I put in to begin with, because yeast multiplies. Okay, let's put that to the side. Let's mix this around a little bit more. There we go. So what we have here, this is a little bit wetter. I don't know how well you can see it from the camera. That's a bit wetter than the no-knead bread that I did a video on last week. Okay. So all we need to do now, put the lid over it, and if we let that sit on a table overnight, when we come back, we're going to see that it has started to bubble and form. The gases and the carbon dioxide are coming out, and it is going to start to smell like stale beer. So I've got one that I made yesterday, and I'm going to open this up. And if I sniff inside it, it makes me smile. That's how you can tell that you got a good yeast going. It's a nice fragrant smell of booze coming out of it. And if you look in this, I'm hoping that you can see it in the camera, it is all bubbly on the top. That tells us that our yeast is nice and activated, it's happy. So what it's doing right now is it is consuming the flour and it's releasing carbon dioxide, and that's exactly what we need for bread to be made. Now, this, once it's started to form and rise, so the next day, you could take this and you would just put it in your fridge and you would leave it there and you would use a little bit as needed. Because this is a live culture, we have to continue to feed it. It's kind of like looking after a goldfish. It doesn't need a lot of help in tending, but it'll need about a couple tablespoons of flour, a couple tablespoons of water, and a stir if you were making bread, say, once a week. So as we remove some of the starter to make bread, we have to put a little bit more back in. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Let's move on to how we would use it. All right, now say I want to make bread or cinnamon buns in the afternoon. Well, a couple hours before I would normally get started, what I would do is I would get a bowl that I'm going to use. I would get my liquid ingredients, and say it called for a couple of cups. I would measure that, make sure that my liquid ingredients are just a little bit on the lukewarm side. I would pour them into a bowl. And instead of adding your dry ingredients, so your flour, all at once, I would probably just put in maybe about a cup. That's provided your recipe was calling for a couple of cups of liquid ingredient. And then I would take my starter from the fridge and I would put in a couple of tablespoons. There we go. Whether you put a little more or a little less isn't going to matter. It's all going to start to create and move its culture. Then I'll mix it around. And this is not doughy at all. This is very, very liquidy. Almost like a soup. Maybe a cream of mushroom soup. And then after I've done that, I'm gonna just leave it sit. Maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. What you're gonna see is you're gonna see it start to bubble, and you're gonna start to smell that yeast coming off it. When you start to smell that and see it bubble, it's time to just continue with your recipe for whatever other ingredients it calls for and make your dough. It's as simple as that. If you were running low on starter, just put a little bit less in, and you might leave it sit a little bit longer until that yeast has a time to multiply. That's all there is to it. So if all we were doing were those cinnamon buns or those couple of loaves of bread, we would then take our starter and we would feed it. We would add more flour, we would add more water, we would mix it around a little bit, we'd put the lid back on, and we'd stick it inside the fridge. And that would be that. So there's no real reason to hoard yeast or keep a whole lot of it, because if you're going to run with a starter, this will go indefinitely. If you were going to be baking more often, you'd be using a larger jar or a larger bowl, and you would just take some, feed some. All there is to it. Now there's people out here right now in all of our neighborhoods that don't have yeast. And I want to talk a little bit about how do you practice safe yeast sharing with your neighbors. Well, a couple of easy things. One, if you have a number of packets and you've already made a starter for yourself, you can take a packet of 3, you can just separate it out and give a packet to the neighbors. You just drop it on their doorstep, make it real easy. If you had a jar like this, well, you could take some envelopes. You could put them in little envelopes, just the same way that you're putting together, like if you open up a package of carrot seeds. You only need a small amount, so you could divvy it up. There'd be nothing stopping you from being able to put some seeds inside an envelope and send it in the mail if a person was really far off, if you had to. Okay? If you're using it from a jar, once you've opened a jar, you need to put it back in the freezer. That way the yeast will keep as long as possible. So it's pretty simple. Another way that you can do it, if you want to service a larger amount of people, or maybe the last yeast you used was to make your starter, you can easily give a person a little starter kit. All you do is take a plastic cup, put a dollop of yeast inside it. That's all they need to get going. Ziploc bag, seal it up, and if you're a good neighbor, you just leave that on your doorstep, and that's it. That's as simple as it is to share yeast and to share a starter culture. No more difficult than that. So there's no reason to really keep more yeast than you need. Now, if there are some of you out there that live in a very remote area and you don't have neighbors that have a yeast culture going or any yeast that they can share with you, there are ways from the pioneering days where you can create yeast by using fruit as a starting point for it, and there's a couple other methods with just using the flour and the water. Feel free to message me. I will send you information directly on that. For everyone else out there, please be safe. Share if you have with your neighbors. Keep your culture going. We don't know how long we're going to need to use these skills in making breads. Just make sure you keep an active culture going. And as long as someone has a culture in your neighborhood, you can always share and you can always get things off and started. Be safe, be healthy. Please click subscribe now for my newest cooking videos. A printable recipe and ingredients list can be found on my blog page. You'll find the link in the video description box. Thank you and have a great day.